Hello and welcome to an introduction to Kolbe. I'm very excited to explain to you how Kolbe applies to you and your business and how you can use it as a really powerful tool in your workplace. So first of all, what does Kolbe measure? Well, Kolbe measures your innate strengths. This is literally the hardwiring in your brain. So what does that mean? That it doesn't change. This is something that will be the same throughout your entire life because it literally tells us how you like to do things, how you are hardwired to do things. So we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So I want to clarify, it is not a personality test. In fact, personalities can change over the years, and they often do. So whether or not a personality test is as powerful of a tool as your Kolbe, I would personally say not, because if you take a personality test and you still work somewhere 10 years later and you've never retaken it, they can't assume that you still have that same exact personality. But your innate strengths that are measured by the Kolbe does not change. In fact, you can take it when you're 8 and again when you're 80, and it should be pretty much the same. And it is not associated with your affective or cognitive functions. Now, your affective are your feelings, your motivations. It's not associated with that. And your cognitive function is your intelligence. Not associated with that either. It doesn't matter how smart or whatever. Your Kolbe does not change. Your Kolbe still tells us how you like to do things, communicate, and accomplish tasks and make decisions. So let's dig into how this works necessarily. So here you can see the creative process. Obviously, we are given some sort of a motivation. We go first to our instincts, and then do we want to do it? We might reason whether we accomplish something or not, or whether we take action on something. And then the Kolbe tells us how we will take action. So for example, your motivation might be get your job done. Your instinct says, well, if I don't get my job done, I could lose my job, which means I could lose my livelihood, which means I can't pay my bills, which means I can't survive. And your instincts in this capacity right here are really about your mothering instincts, your fight or flight, your survival instincts. Those are the kind of instincts we're talking about right here. So obviously, if you're given the motivation, do your job, your instinct is to stay alive, which means you need your livelihood. Your will say, okay, we probably should do this because if we don't, then we will not have money to pay bills and survive. And then it goes to your Kolbe where it says how you will do your job. Because when they say do your paperwork and all that stuff, how you do it is not determined by any of this stuff. It's determined right here in your Kolbe. And this is why this is such a powerful tool. Let me just clarify further. It tells us how we naturally make decisions. And I'll give you a great analogy at the end of this to really flesh this out for you and really hopefully clarify what the Kolbe is really telling us. So it also tells us what we need to make decisions. Do we need information? Do we need a plan? Do we need nothing? Do we need to just go? Some people can just make decisions like that. Other people have to really think things through. So it tells us what we need to make decisions. It tells us how we prefer to work. So again, it is how we naturally tend to operate. So how we prefer to work, how we naturally communicate is a big one. And this is so powerful for the job market and the workplace, of course. And not only that, but what best tasks or jobs there are for us. So just to clarify, it is not an excuse to not complete certain tasks, aka that doesn't fit my Kolbe. You may be given a task that doesn't fit your Kolbe. That does not mean you can't do it. You absolutely can do it. You just may not love doing it. You might not be the best at it, and it may cause you stress, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. It does not determine how smart you are or how capable or skilled you are. It has nothing to do with your personality. As we've talked about, it does not tell us whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, so your social tendency, none of that. It's not determined by motivation. So motivation can actually change your Kolbe. So again, if we go back to this example here, If your motivation is not to lose your job, even though something might not jive right here, like maybe you are an innovative, like to change things, and they're going to give you some kind of paperwork job that doesn't really fit your Kolbe, your motivation is going to have you do that job anyway because you don't want to lose your job, right? You're going to do the paperwork even though you're not great with fine detail because you don't want to lose your job. So your motivation will cause you to act outside of your Kolbe, and you'll get the paperwork done even though that's not something that you love to do. So again, not determined by motivation. So why is it so important for employers? If it's not already clear, because every job has a Kolbe as well. So jobs have certain strengths that are necessary for it. Every job, if you have somebody who works a lot with fine detail, that's a strength. It's not everyone is good with fine detail. There are certain people who have a natural tendency to have great attention to detail. So do you need someone detail oriented? Or maybe rather than detail oriented, you need someone who's a great planner, somebody who can map out processes and create systems. Or maybe you need someone who is not very systematic at all. In fact, they're very nimble and they can adapt quickly to change, and day by day things are different and they're totally comfortable with that. Or maybe you need someone who's a great builder, somebody who is very hands-on. They love working with their hands. These are all different strengths that the Kolbe actually measures. So really powerful stuff. Every job is not created equal. Somebody who's responsible for lots of data and paperwork truly requires different strengths than someone who's going to be designing and innovating new marketing campaigns. These are both strengths measured by the Kolbe. So if when you are hiring, you only look for candidates who have longevity or a certain degree or other qualities that are generic in this nature, then you're not searching for the qualities that are essential to success in the actual job you are hiring for. The Kolbe assessments are meant to identify not only the strengths that each individual has, but there are assessments available to employers that will allow them to discover the strengths that particular jobs require. This is really powerful stuff. That actually is the Kolbe C. You won't find that link on this page. There's only the Kolbe A, B, and Y. The Kolbe Y is for youth, so you can give this to your child as young as 6 or 7. The Kolbe C is something that you really have to work with Kolbe on. Now, the ABCs of Kolbe, since I am talking about Kolbe assessments, the Kolbe A, which you can find the link on this page, is the assessment for a potential hire. This is for a person to take about themselves, and it will tell you about what their strengths are. Okay? The Kolbe B is actually for an employee to take about their position. So I could take, well, I'm not going to use myself. Let's say somebody in your company, let's say an assistant, they could take a Kolbe B for the assistant job. It will tell you about what is required from their point of view from that position. You can also compare their Kolbe A to what they take for their Kolbe B to find out if they're having stress in certain areas. You may actually be able to resolve those stresses by comparing a Kolbe A and a Kolbe B for a person. The Kolbe C, as I have mentioned, is actually a Kolbe that you would take. Let's say you want to hire an assistant, and you in your mind have certain qualities that you know you need for that assistant position. Maybe you need someone with great attention to detail or a great planner. The Kolbe C would allow you to take that for that position, and it would create a range of success so that when you start using Kolbe A's, you can compare them to the Kolbe C for that particular position when you're hiring for that position. So really powerful tool. Again, you do need to talk to Kolbe if you want to utilize the Kolbe C. Now, if you want to know more about the Kolbe, then keep watching because I'm going to dig in a little bit more here. Now, this is actually, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead, and then I'll show you that a little bit more. So this is your Kolbe. This is what a Kolbe looks like when you have taken it. Now you can see there's numbers here, and there's the different categories here. So if I go back here, I actually outlined it and I'll show you this. So we have 1 through 3, that's this top category up here. Now she did the 1 through 3 at top, and by she I mean Kathy Kolbe, the founder and creator of the Kolbe assessment. She did this because 1 through 3 does not mean bad, and that's why she put it at the top. She flipped it because she didn't want people to feel like when they are in this low range that it's a bad thing, because it's not. It just means something different. So this mid range is your 1 through, or I'm sorry, this first range is your 1 through 3. Your mid range is your 4 through 6, and your 7 through 10 is your high range or dominant range. So this, when you have a 7 through 10, this will actually determine what your dominant category is. A lot of people have a dominant category. Not everyone, I won't get into that here, but most people do. So let's look at this now. So you can see there's a Kolbe here. This is actually very similar to my Kolbe. I just didn't bother to cut mine out. I have this image handy. Mine's actually a 6473. So very, very similar to my Kolbe. And what does this tell us? Well, this 6 right here tells us that this person is good at explaining information. As you can see, we have the 4 categories here. Fact finding is telling us how people deal with information. Do they like to simplify information? Do they like to explain or dig in more to that information? Or do they really like to dig into specifics? This category here, these are your people who are great with fine detail. So that detail-oriented person that you need is right here in a 7 through 10. These people are wonderful with facts and lawyers. Oh my goodness, if lawyers, great lawyers are really high in this because they have that attention to fine detail. And what's interesting is, and I won't get into this too much, but when you see these 4s and these 6s, they're right on the edge here. So they can actually, if they need to, lean into this other category that they bump up against. A 6 can lean into specificity. As you can see, as I am a 6, I'm getting a bit more specific. And when I'm really motivated, I really enjoy a topic, I can get really specific about topics. So that's just an interesting little tidbit about what happens when you're on the edge. Same with a 3. This 3 can lean into this category a little bit more. So just a little fun fact there. But moving on, so the follow-through section, I would actually rename this section the planner section, because it's not really about whether you follow through with tasks. It does not, this category is not the people who follow through and nobody else does. That's not how this works. This is our planner category. So these people here are not big planners. They tend to adapt to whatever plan you give them, and they're fine with that. They're very comfortable with that. These people tend to maintain plans. You give this people, I say us because I'm in this category, I'm a 4, but you give these people a plan and they can maintain it. They can follow your plan. These people tend to create plans. They are your systematizers. So they are very pragmatic and tend to, when they're given a task, they're going to figure out how they're going to accomplish it from start to finish. So they tend to plan and then work their plan. This third category is our quick start category, and this category really is your improvisers. So down here, and I will say about quick starts, they tend to drive change. And when I'm saying those quick starts tend to drive change, I do mean the 7 through 10 category, which is my people. As I mentioned, I'm a 7. But down here, this 1 through 3, they tend to stabilize. Obviously, everything does not need to change. You don't want everything changing. It would be very chaotic. So you have these people to balance your 7 through 10s. Those of us who love to create change. We love to drive change. These are the people who go, oh, do we really need to change that? Maybe we could just, reconsider, just keep it the same. But you don't want all of these people either, because then nothing would change. And that's where this category is great, because they can say, oh, do we need to change it? Don't we need to change it? And they're very able to adapt. They're actually, I think of these categories as similar, but in different respects. So these people can adapt. They can either go with the change, and sometimes they push change, and sometimes they push stabilization. Really depends. And moving on, your implementer, another category I would rename to your builder, or your something like that, because this really has to do with how much people like to work with their hands. How much do you need to work in the tangible? Your 1 through 3s, which is again my people, we are your what's the word I'm looking for? Imagineers. I think that's a position in Disney. But these are the people who you can describe something to them and they can picture it. In this category, they actually have a harder time with that. They really need that tangible. They need to build. These people like to build not just for the sake of building, but build to last. So what I can say about this is these people don't tend to love to work with their hands. I do get tired out before I ever finish a single IKEA furniture piece. And these people have a tendency to sometimes literally restore. I have friends in this range who will restore furniture and things like that. They won't necessarily do like a 7 through 10 and go get wood and build it from scratch, but they might restore some furniture. So this is a really interesting category. This actually, I don't want to get into it too much, but they have a lot, this actually measures your spatial awareness and things like that. There's a lot more to this category than I can get into here, but you can see how each section breaks down what the strengths are. My strength would be imagining versus somebody who's a 7 through 10 whose strength really is to build it, to realize it. So when somebody describes something, they say, oh, this is what it is. This person can actually create it. I'm not going to go create it. I can just picture it in my mind because my strength is to imagine. So moving on, when you actually assess somebody, Kolbe's can come through inconclusive. And this is important to understand if you intend to use this. I wanted to talk about this because if you use this, I want you to be able to explain this to your candidates. So here's what you need to know about giving candidates a Kolbe assessment. If they try to fake it out, it will produce an inconclusive result. So you always want to stress that being the most honest they can be with the Kolbe assessment will give them a conclusive answer, and they are more likely to get the job. If you get an inconclusive answer, there's not much you can do about that because you really can't retest them right away. Kolbe actually recommends you wait 14 to 28 days before you retest. So you want to impress upon them that being totally honest and going with their gut is the best thing they can do to be able to get themselves a job. So overthinking is something that will produce inconsistent results. So this really is about instincts, and overthinking can throw that off. So make sure that you really impress upon them that overthinking can create an inconclusive result. Again, putting them in the position where they may not now be eligible for the job because you don't have a consistent Kolbe for them. Because I personally do not recommend hiring unless you have a Kolbe and make sure that it's a match for the position. I can say with absolute certainty that when I finally made that a policy, it completely changed my turnover. I want you to think about that. When I made that a policy, sometimes we would, there was definitely a time where we used Kolbe. Sometimes we would hire without having their Kolbe, and we'd just be like, I think they're going to be great. Let's take a chance on them. And we ended up with somebody with a really not good Kolbe for a position. They were not successful, and it really bit us in the butt. So we finally made it a policy. If we don't have a conclusive Kolbe on you, we will not offer you a position. I highly recommend making that move in your business. But overthinking will cause you to have a inconclusive result. Make sure that they are going honestly from their gut and not overthinking things. In transition is part of that inconclusive result. It can occur when a person is in transition. It refers to people who are going through huge changes in their lives. And if they're interviewing with you, then they are considering a job change, which is a huge transition in their lives. That can also include things like moving, new marriages, new life changes of that nature. Even something like, you've moved your mother in to live with you. That's a transitional phase where you're going through a big transition in your life. Recent tragedies, things like that. So let individuals be aware that they are currently in transition because they're already considering a new job. So reiterate, do not overthink. People are already, if they're in transition, they're already prone to inaccurately answering questions because of their transitional status, So be aware, even when they get those tough questions, because there are questions in the Kolbe that are like, oh my gosh, I could pick any of these answers. Just do the best you can and move on. Don't overthink it. And as a final note, Here's an example that I can put out to you that will help explain how the Kolbe works. So 4 people with 4 different Kolbe strengths were placed in a room with paint materials and told to paint the room. The fact finder Googled how to paint the room, researched best practices, and then painted the room. The follow through, and actually let me back up. And the reason the fact finders do that is because they tend to defer to what has already been done in order to accomplish something. So they tend to research when they need to accomplish a task, and then they can execute. So they researched and they painted the room. The follow through, who has a tendency to integrate past, present, and future, created a plan based on what they had now, where they're trying to get to. They taped out the whole room, made sure their edges were great to go, created a plan, worked methodically, and painted the room. The quick start just picked up a brush and began painting the room, and they painted the room. The implementer took time to determine if there was primer necessary or whether they had the right materials or the best materials, and then they painted the room. The point is that they all painted the room. Kolbe is not an excuse to not do something. When you say there's a right way to do something, it's usually you acting upon your own personal Kolbe, and that seems right. But it's only what is right for you. This right way of doing things can cause friction between a person and a job, or even between 2 people. Whether they're communicating, when you have somebody training another person and they're showing them the right way to do something, that just means it's right for their own Kolbe. If they're training a person who has a different Kolbe, it may not be right for them. And sometimes you'll have people correct them and say, "Oh, you're not doing that right." They're not necessarily doing it wrong. So that's another really interesting point that the Kolbe makes, is that they may do it differently, but different does not mean wrong. So, and obviously communication styles. A fact finder gives a lot more detail than perhaps a quick start might need. If you have a fact finder who's a 3 talking to a fact finder who's a 7, the person who has that 3 does not need as much detail as the person who is a 7 is going to give them. So it's really interesting how it also determines how people communicate. This powerful tool lifts the fog and clears the air. Everyone has their own strengths, and Kolbe allows us to properly identify those strengths. So the Kolbe tools and assessments, there's more than the 3 assessments outlined here, and obviously there's already a 4th one on this page. So accessible on this page are the links for the A, B, and Y, which is for children. There's also the Kolbe R, which is for relationships, where you can compare yours and your significant others to see where you guys might have conflicts and how you can better communicate with one another. If you have any other questions about the Kolbe, obviously I love talking about it, so you can always email me. That's lane@lpsolutionsflorida.com with more questions about the Kolbe assessments, trainings, and other tools. So use those links, get your Kolbe today, and I look forward to seeing what you can do once you all know how strong you are.